Hi guys, Matt from Pomelo Pictures here, and today is a very exciting day because I've just received my very first custom Game Boy Advance. Now, I'm going to go through this with you, show you a few of the features, but before I do, just a brief history of the Game Boy Advance itself. Now, some of you may know, and some of you may not, that the original Game Boy, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance were all non-frontlit and non-backlit systems. They instead used a reflective foil that was put behind the main part of the screen and reflected back atmospheric light. It worked reasonably well with the original Game Boy because there was a dial on the side which allowed you to crank up or down the contrast, which meant that you could manually adjust what picture you saw. When it came to the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy Advance, however, this didn't work quite so well. The fact that it was in colour, you couldn't change the contrast, and particularly with the Game Boy Advance because of the slightly more complicated graphics, it made it very hard to see, even when you were in direct sunlight, because you got a lot of glare on the screen, a lot of reflections coming back at you as well. Now, Nintendo fixed this somewhat when they released the Game Boy Advance SP. It came with a hinged screen, which protected it from scratches, but also this was frontlit. It was essentially the same screen as on the original model Game Boy Advance. However, there were a few LEDs in the bezeling, which meant that it was a little easier to see in different light sources. But styling-wise, it was great as well. It was around about the time that flip phones were all the rage and laptops were starting to become a little bit more affordable and accessible. But it also meant that not only was the screen protected, but it made it a lot smaller, and it was actually a truly pocket handheld as opposed to the Game Boy Pocket. It had a few other advantages as well. For example, it had a rechargeable battery and also an AC port as standard, which meant that you could also just plug it into the wall and play it at home. It does have its disadvantages though. The 101 screen is a lot easier to see than the 001, and we never got it. But also, in terms of form factor, when we were kids this was great, but as we grow up, some of us have found that it's a little bit cramped playing this. It's okay for me, but bigger guys and, well, bigger girls have said that they don't quite appreciate this as much as the original model. And so, therefore, there was a scene in modding original model Game Boy Advances to have that 101 backlit screen. You keep the form factor of the original Game Boy Advance, but you have the advantage of that better screen. Now, you may notice that the one I have here is actually two-tone orange and white, and that's not on purpose. You see, when I first got this, it was all orange, but I quickly realised that it was an aftermarket case, and the plastics on it are a little bit flimsy, they don't quite feel the same. But not only that, when I actually started to film with it, I realised that the battery contacts didn't work as well as they should do. So I got my original model Game Boy Advance and I swapped out the backs, and since I've done that, it works a lot better. Another thing that I don't quite like about this model is that the guy that built this for me had to obviously glue the screen in place, and unfortunately there are a few specks of dirt or dust underneath the lens which I can't get to because the screen has been glued in place. But to be honest, when you're actually playing it, you don't notice that as much. Now, obviously, the big selling point is that 101 screen, and to show you what it looks like, I'm going to show it in comparison to an original Game Boy Advance and also the SP with the frontlit screen. So obviously you can see that the backlit screen is a lot easier to see. Actually, with the studio lighting, the original Game Boy Advance doesn't look that bad, but when you hold it in certain directions, you start to see there is a lot more reflection coming back, and a lot of glare coming off the screen compared to the 101. The 101 is actually a lot easier to see in sort of all forms of light, and there is a lot less glare as well. And to be fair, the original model SP001 looks pretty good under the studio lighting as well, but trust me, in real life it is very obvious which is the better screen. Now, it's a matter of personal preference, but when it comes to playing original Game Boy games, I actually prefer to play them on an original Game Boy, and you can get backlit and biverted original model Game Boys. The bivert basically means that it inverts the colours and then you use a polarizing filter to invert them again, hence bivert, and the picture is a lot clearer. And while you can get them on places like eBay, there are good ones out there and there are bad ones, so I wouldn't necessarily always trust them. This is one that I've made myself, and it's just a backlight, there is no bivert, but as you can see, the process of adding that backlight doesn't always come out very well. Sometimes when you remove the foil, there's some residue left over, and changing the contrast, you get a few little glitchy areas or line drop. Also, if you're not really that interested in playing original Game Boy or Game Boy Color games, and you just want to play Game Boy Advance, then of course you can also do that on a Nintendo DS or DS Lite. Both models included a slot at the bottom which was used for a number of different things. It was for RAM expansion on the internet cart, a few different accessories for some games, but it also plays Game Boy Advance games, not original Game Boy or Game Boy Color games, but the screen is pretty comparable to the AGS 101. I think the 101 is still better and it is a bigger screen, but in terms of price, you'll spend a lot less money on a DS Lite than you will do on a modded Game Boy. For me, I think my favourite way of playing original Game Boy, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance games at the moment is on my modded Game Boy Advance. However, I may still find myself buying an SP 101 for a few different reasons. Whilst the one I have here has been modded to have a glass screen instead of the plastic one so that it's less likely to get scratches, I still prefer the idea of being able to close it so that it protects the screen completely. Also, the one thing I did notice in terms of battery life, although this could use an original model Game Boy Advance AC adapter or rechargeable battery or even rechargeable AA's, means that the batteries get eaten through pretty quickly. It's not just the fact that the SP has a rechargeable battery as standard, but it also has a way of dimming the screen so that you can reserve power, and it also means that you can adjust the brightness of the screen depending on the light settings around you. One of the things stopping me from buying an SP101 is that some games simply won't work on it. Games like Kirby Tilt and Tumble or Yoshi's Universal Gravitation, which have a gyroscope inside, just will not work on the system. You see, the reason for that is these games were designed to be placed inside the console upright. There's a gyroscope inside which calibrates when held flat, and then you move the console around and even flip it up and down to make the character jump. The problem is, however, when you take this out of a Game Boy Color or a Game Boy Advance and pop it in the SP, it doesn't go the right way up. It goes upside down. And while it may be able to calibrate if you put it flat, you're then holding the console and the cartridge upside down, so you'd have to play this way, but then the screen is upside down. So you see, it simply doesn't work. They weren't designed to be used on the SP. When it comes to upgrading your old tech, the Game Boy is often first on people's list because of the problems of it having no front light or backlight. And there is that choice between whether you go for an official backlit SP101 or a Game Boy Micro or even a DS Lite, or you go for the modded Game Boy Advance that retains that nice form factor with the backlit screen. And as I say, I think I really like this model, but again, it's going to come down to personal preference. However, the guy that built me this does actually modify all sorts of Game Boys, so I'll put a link in the description below to his Instagram page, and you can take a look at some of his projects and maybe even buy one for yourself. In the meantime, there is a big library of Game Boy Advance games that I haven't taken full advantage of yet, and I'm going to do that now. Until next time, guys, thank you for watching, and I will see you later.